The story of Christopher Columbus discovering America has long been known and hotly debated. Can it really be called a discovery when the land was already inhabited? And what about the fact that he stumbled across South and Central America, not what we generally define as North America? These questions are valid, but often overshadow another important inquiry. Why do we credit the discovery of the Americas by Europeans to Columbus and not the Vikings? Roughly 5 centuries before Christopher Columbus even laid eyes on American land, it was Leif Erikson, a Scandinavian Viking, who stepped onto North American soil. And now, it's believed that he was actually the first European to ever do so. Leif Erikson was born in Iceland sometime around 970 AD to the prominent Viking explorer Eric the Red. Eric had first lived in Iceland after his father had been banished from their ancestral land of Norway for manslaughter. But when Leif was just a boy, Eric himself was exiled from Iceland for following his father's footsteps and murdering a neighbor. This meant that Leif spent part of his childhood in Greenland, where Eric had founded a new settlement. Once in adulthood, Erikson made the decision to journey to Norway, at which time King Olaf I Tryggvason convinced the young adventurer to convert to Christianity. The monarch then gave Leif the task of going back to Greenland to convert his fellow pagan settlers. But what actually happens next is unclear. That's because there are two sagas that give us differing ideas of how Leif Erikson spent his next years. Sagas are Icelandic legends, originally passed down and around by word of mouth, but later written down in the following centuries. In the case of Erikson, there are two sagas pertaining to the journey he took to the New World. While both give a timeline beginning around 1000 AD, the rest of the details tend to differ. In one saga, known as the Saga of Greenlanders, the story goes that Leif had heard fantastical tales of a mysterious land across the ocean from a man by the name of Bjarni Herjolfsson. Bjarni was a trader from Iceland who had sailed roughly a decade earlier toward what was supposed to be Greenland, but ended up being more in the direction of North America. While he never stepped foot on the land he had spotted off in the distance, he knew it was there, and that he had without a doubt overshot Greenland. Leif Erikson was thus profoundly intrigued by this idea of an undiscovered land, and decided to rally a crew to join him on a voyage to this new world. With 35 men and a ready ship, Leif was off to recreate Bjarni's journey. The explorer and his crew managed to sail successfully across the vast Atlantic until finally reaching the shores of North America, specifically somewhere in what is present-day Canada. Erikson named his new discovery Hetluland, which in Old Norse meant stone slab land, a fitting name for what the Vikings had at their feet. Today, historians have narrowed this area down to what they think is Baffin Island, but of course, the saga itself couldn't specify. What it did say next was that the Scandinavians now made their way further south, likely to modern-day Labrador, which Leif thus called Markland, meaning forest land for its multitude of trees and lumber resources. This new world was already proving to be quite a positive find, and the Vikings became even more entranced as they made their way to what historians believe was the tip of Newfoundland. This is where it seems that Erikson and his men set up their base camp and spent the coming winter. Taking advantage of the more tolerable weather than they were familiar with back home, the Vikings' further explorations unearthed vast rivers filled to the brim with delicious salmon, stunning greenery all around, and so many wild grapes that Leif terms the region Vinland, or Wineland. All of this sounds wonderful and like an explorer's dream, but that's where the main foundation of the two sagas differ. According to the second, the saga of Eric the Red, discovering the New World wasn't an adventure success. It was a mistake. This alternative version posits that Leif was actually on his way back from Norway to Greenland, and it was he who overshot and stumbled across the American continent. Whatever the reason for the trip, Ericsson and his men eventually made their way back to Greenland, around which time the death of Eric the Red made Leif the new chief of the Greenland settlement. From that point, Ericsson would never again return to North American lands, leaving behind no permanent settlement or colony where his Canadian adventure had occurred. Other Vikings, however, would continue to explore the New World over the following years, and multiple temporary settlements were established. Only 3 years after Leif's expedition, his brother, Torvald, had been on an excursion of his own in North America when ongoing conflict with the native populations eventually led to his murder, making him what many believe to be the first European ever buried in American ground. But that's still technically speculation, and many say that this whole narrative is yet unproven. In fact, can we trust these sagas at all? Are they real history? If you ask quite a few historians, archaeologists, and the like, yes, we can trust the Icelandic stories, and they do include actual historical facts, even if some of the details may have been tweaked over the years. Evidence to support the stories of Leif's trip to North America have been found, and it correlates tightly with the sagas. Back in 1960, Helge Ingstad, a Norwegian explorer in the search of Viking remnants in modern-day Canada, found just what he was looking for. After tirelessly probing the coasts of Labrador and Newfoundland, Helge unearthed remains of a centuries-old settlement on the northern tip of Newfoundland, particularly in the L'Anse aux Meadows. An archaeology team made up of archaeologists from around the world was thus brought in to examine Ingstad's findings, and the subsequent excavation confirmed that these ruins did belong to Vikings and were traced back to the same century that Ericsson had allegedly settled in the area. Furthermore, according to a piece in a journal called Nature, scientists had gone to the next level and actually tested 3 pieces of wood from the Viking ruins to see if they could pin down the exact year that they had been used. According to the journal, the project was successful, and the scientists were able to determine that the lumber had been cut in the year 1021 AD. While this might at first seem to contradict the sagas, which puts Leif's expedition closer to 1000 AD, many scholars say no, it does nothing of the sort. One in particular, a Viking specialist with the Institute for Northern Studies in Scotland by the name of Dr. Colleen Beatty, notes that the existence of Vikings in North America in the 1020s doesn't negate the fact that they could have also been there at the start of the century. According to Dr. Beatty, whatever prompted the Vikings to cut down those trees in 1021 could very well have been one stage of the occupation activity, not necessarily the first. And it's important to remember that it has already been theorized that a string of follow-up expeditions had pursued Ericsson's. Whether the ruins found were built in 1021 AD or the lumber tested was part of later repairs of an older structure, we can't know without testing the whole thing. But none of this disproves the sagas, even if the timeline is slightly off. If anything, this evidence further supports the entire narrative. So, was Christopher Columbus the first European to discover the Americas? Or was it Leif Erikson and his band of Vikings? Did Columbus discover the south and central parts, and the Vikings found the north 500 years earlier? Or can we even call any of it a discovery, given the vast population of indigenous tribes that the continent already hosted? All of that is up for debate, but it seems that the stories told in Icelandic legends about a Viking explorer finding the New World are no longer debatable. Today, the remains of Ericsson's settlement in Newfoundland are part of an UNESCO heritage site. And in 1964, American President Lyndon Johnson declared October 9th to be Leif Erikson Day, marking the anniversary of the 1825 landing of the Restoration, bringing the first organized shipload of Norwegian immigrants to the United States. Coincidentally, early October also holds the date of Christopher Columbus Day, and in 2023, both adventurers will be commemorated on the same day. Columbus and Ericsson both brought European life and death to American soil. Both intruded on the land of the Native American tribes in the name of exploration and colonization. But technically, it was the Vikings that discovered North America first.